What if I told you that an ancient Greek myth holds secrets that modern neuroscience is just beginning to understand? The terrifying tale of Medusa, whose gaze turned men to stone, may reveal fascinating insights into how the human mind works. Welcome to today's video, where we'll explore 5 intriguing ways the myth of Medusa connects to neuroscience and psychology. From psychological trauma to the mysteries of perception, Medusa's story is more than just an ancient legend. It's a window into the human brain. Medusa's transformation from a beautiful maiden into a terrifying gorgon is one of the most striking aspects of her myth. But if we look deeper, her change can be seen as a metaphor for psychological trauma. In many versions of the myth, Medusa's transformation occurs after she is assaulted by Poseidon in Athena's temple. This traumatic event marks a profound change in her, both physically and mentally, as she goes from being a symbol of beauty to a creature feared by all. In modern neuroscience, we know that trauma can cause permanent changes in the brain. Intense stress, especially when experienced over long periods or during formative years, can literally rewire the brain. The hippocampus, which is involved in memory, can shrink. The amygdala, responsible for processing fear, becomes overactive, and the prefrontal cortex, which helps regulate emotions, can become impaired. Just as Medusa's trauma physically transformed her into a monster, trauma in real life can reshape the brain, leading to long-term effects on emotional health, relationships, and behavior. Medusa's myth might reflect an ancient understanding of how deeply trauma impacts a person. Her transformation into a gorgon isn't just a curse. It symbolizes how life-altering events can leave us feeling monstrous, disconnected from our former selves. One of the most iconic aspects of Medusa's myth is her deadly gaze. Anyone who looked into her eyes was instantly turned to stone. This powerful image can be linked to modern neuroscience through the study of vision and perception. In the brain, vision isn't just about the eyes taking in information. It's a complex process that involves the brain interpreting what we see. Different areas of the brain work together to form a complete picture. The occipital lobe processes visual input, the temporal lobe helps us recognize faces and objects, and the parietal lobe is involved in spatial awareness. Medusa's gaze, then, can be interpreted as a metaphor for the overwhelming power of perception. There is also an interesting parallel in psychology with the concept of the gaze. The idea that being looked at, or the way we perceive being looked at, can deeply affect our emotions and sense of self. The power dynamics of being the observer versus being observed can create feelings of vulnerability, judgment, or dominance. Medusa's myth takes this to an extreme. Her gaze represents the ultimate power, immobilizing others not just physically, but psychologically. In a way, it's a reflection of the all-consuming nature of being seen, or seeing too much. After her transformation, Medusa is exiled to a desolate island, isolated from the world. Her isolation is not just a punishment, it's a reflection of the deep loneliness that can come from being marked as different. Neuroscience has shown that social isolation can have severe consequences on brain health. Loneliness is more than just a feeling. It's a biological state that triggers a stress response in the brain. Prolonged isolation can increase the risk of mental health disorders, like depression and anxiety. Studies have found that chronic loneliness can cause the brain's stress response system, particularly the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, to become overactive. This leads to higher levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, which in turn damages the brain over time, particularly in areas responsible for memory and learning. Medusa's exile can be seen as a metaphor for the isolation that often accompanies mental illness or social stigmatization. Just as she is cast out and feared, people who experience trauma or feel disconnected from society can suffer the harmful effects of isolation, both mentally and physically. Her story may serve as an ancient reminder of the importance of social bonds and the devastating impact of loneliness on the human mind. Medusa is not just a symbol of trauma and isolation, she also wields immense power. Her ability to inspire fear in anyone who looks at her is central to the myth. In neuroscience, fear is an emotion that is deeply rooted in our biology, with significant survival implications. But it's also a complex emotion that affects both the mind and body in profound ways. When we experience fear, the brain's amygdala is activated, triggering a fight-or-flight response. This is the brain's way of preparing the body to face a threat or escape it. Heart rate increases, breathing quickens, and adrenaline floods the system. Fear can be paralyzing, just like Medusa's gaze, which literally freezes her victims in place. The myth may represent an exaggerated version of this natural human response to danger. Interestingly, Medusa herself becomes a victim of the very fear she embodies. While she instills terror in others, she is also a figure of tragedy. Trapped in a state where her own power isolates her, this dynamic parallels how fear, when uncontrolled, can dominate our lives. Chronic fear and anxiety can lead to a heightened state of alertness, where the brain is constantly preparing for threats that may not exist, an exhausting and debilitating state. Medusa's power, like the fear response in our brains, can protect but also imprison us. Over centuries, the myth of Medusa has been interpreted in many ways. In ancient times, she was seen as a monstrous figure of fear and destruction. In modern feminist interpretations, she has been reimagined as a symbol of female rage, empowerment, and the consequences of male violence. This evolving interpretation of Medusa's myth mirrors the way our understanding of the human brain has evolved. In ancient times, people thought the brain was simply a cooling mechanism for the blood. It wasn't until much later that we began to understand the brain as the seat of thought, emotion, and consciousness. Even now, neuroscience is an ever-evolving field. New discoveries about neuroplasticity, brain regions, and the impacts of genetics and environment are continually reshaping our understanding of the mind. Just as Medusa's story has been reinterpreted over time, our understanding of the brain has shifted from simplistic views to complex, nuanced interpretations. The myth of Medusa may hold timeless truths about the human condition, reflecting the layers of complexity that neuroscience continues to uncover. Medusa's myth, with its layers of trauma, fear, isolation, and power, offers a surprisingly rich metaphor for modern neuroscience. Through the lens of her story, we can see how ancient myths often contain profound insights into the workings of the mind, revealing truths that modern science is only beginning to unravel. From the psychological effects of trauma to the science of fear and isolation, Medusa's story remains as relevant today as it was in ancient times. What other myths do you think could connect with modern science? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this exploration of Medusa's myth through the lens of neuroscience, be sure to check out our other videos.